All right. Well, hello, St. Charles Community College, faculty, staff, students, everyone involved. I want to thank you for coming to this particular presentation, this conversation that we're doing, talking about Black legacy, Black excellence, Black excellence, Black legacy. It is an honor and a privilege for me to introduce the individual that will be engaged with us today. This will be Mr. Donald Calloway Jr., North County resident, born and raised, graduated, matriculated his way down south to Alabama. He kind of got lost. He was supposed to be headed toward Tuskegee University, but got lost along the way and attended Alabama A&M University, which we'll still accept that. Graduated there, decided to go up north, went to Boston to get his law degree there, came back home to Missouri, House representative, went back up to DC again. And there he's made a name for himself by speaking out on a breadth of topics. You can find him he's traded actually barbs in conversation with Tucker Carlson before. He's been on MSNBC with Alex Witt. He's talked about voting, social justice issues, healthcare and zip code issues. He's talked from the Congressional Black Congress before. He's spoken in front of Harris Stowe State University. He's spoken of the Coalition of Black Excellence. He's just an all-around guy engaged in a lot of information, but also remains centered as being a strong family man as well. He's an entrepreneur, helping to start Pine Street Strategies, very much engaged in voting with the National Voter Protection Action Fund, and just an all-around amazing individual. It's an honor to have him here. We're gonna be engaged in a little bit of conversation. He's gonna present some information, gonna ask him some questions about it. We'll talk a little bit. If anyone has any questions, you can just put that, because this is live stream on YouTube, just put that in the chat, and I will be sure to ask those questions to Mr. Calloway, because he is a subject matter expert in this particular area. So for this particular moment in time, I'm going to turn it over to him so that he can expound a little bit more on what I've already talked about. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much, Brother Tobias. Professor Tobias, shall I say, one of my early and often heroes and idols, along with your brother Maurice, who could do anything with a basketball and were the coolest, funniest dudes. Long before the gray beard, Marvin and Maurice, the Twin Towers, were the best brothers on the planet to me and my younger brother. Thank you so much for having me and for the invitation. St. Charles, big fan of all of you alls. I don't know if y'all still call it SCA like you did back in my day, but I am from right across the river, not far at all, but all things considered, very much still live, breathe, and eat and sleep St. Louis, regardless of whether or not I'm in DC. So I look forward to getting these shots in my arm, the world opening back up, and hopefully we can do this in person in the very near future. Yes, like Brother Tobias said, I feel so weird saying Professor Tobias, but I guess that's what I'm supposed to do these days. As Brother Professor Tobias said, I'm Don Calloway. I am the CEO of Pine Street Strategies. We are a public affairs consulting and lobbying firm. Now, I know that lobbyists get a bad name because we work for big tobacco and big alcohol and all these industries who are making the world a better place. But we founded a firm based upon 5 years ago, based upon the principles that we could use our connections and our knowledge of the processes and procedures of American government to work for causes that we believed in. So we represent the National Voter Protection Action Fund, which we founded, and we try to push and create policy to expand ballot box access, particularly in the face of rampant efforts to increase voter suppression and voter intimidation. We represent the Environmental Defense Fund. We represent who pushes environmental justice and combats environmental racist policies all over the country. We represent the National Bankers Association, who's having a wonderful moment right now. The National Bankers Association is an organization of small and minority-owned, Black and minority-owned depository institutions who are often the first line of defense in providing access to capital to Black institutions, Black businesses, Black families who want to buy homes and get loans for issues that come up in family life, start businesses, get capital to access those businesses, and so on and so forth. So we represent causes that we believe in, and we represent clients that we believe are pushing the world forward. I spend the other half of my time as the founder of the National Voter Protection Action Fund, and we present to lawmakers who are interested in preserving our democracy a voter rights legislative agenda. We hear a whole lot from state to state about anti-voting legislative agendas. You hear about this in Georgia and always mentioned with the great Stacey Abrams, but right now there are 240 anti-voting bills throughout the state legislatures and county legislatures and even some cities throughout the country. Well, how do you combat that? You combat that with good voter rights legislation, which opens up ballot box access, which makes it easier to vote instead of more difficult to vote. So that's what we spend a lot of time doing with the National Voter Protection Action Fund. But fundamentally, at my core of core, I am still a practicing lawyer from St. Louis, licensed in Missouri and Illinois and Alabama, and try to use that law license in the way that my parents expected me to, and I was taught to ultimately use the law as a tool in the tradition of the great Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall to push the people forward. Ultimately, all great social change finds its roots in public sentiment, but has to be encoded in the laws of this great country. And I believe that that is still the way. Fortunately, I've been blessed enough to be able to participate in that profession for 16 years now. So fundamentally, I try to look at myself as a practicing lawyer as we go about our work in politics, public affairs, or whatever else the day may call for. So that is a bit about who I am, but I think it's most important that when I try to speak, I do whatever I can to make myself comfortable. And clearly, I'm in my home. I've got the Negro League All-Stars above me, got my favorite books, but I'm not exactly there in terms of being as comfortable as I can be. So Professor Tobias, give me just 10 seconds. I'll be right back.
Oh, this is going to be interesting.
I'll be right back. I promise I'm not trying to dip out on y'all.
I have no fear of that.
Good. All right. Okay, let's get into it, Ska. Let's do it. Spring training, baby. We are here. I hope y'all saw Yadier, who is still the man. I hope y'all saw him throw out that dude last week. It was amazing. If you haven't seen it, follow me on Twitter at DCSTL. I reposted it. It was incredible. He basically dared this young kid to steal a base, and he threw him out by a country mile.
Oh, yeah,
I'm an old school baseball guy, and we'll talk about that hopefully a bit later on. So feeling a lot more comfortable now. Let's get into it. St. Charles Community College. Black excellence, Black legacy. As we are on the precipice of what I would call the third Reconstruction period in the history of our country. What is your role as not only Black college students, but all college students? What is your role and what is the expectation of you as we face a third Reconstruction period in this country, as you all attend college in the cradle of the third civil rights movement, the third Reconstruction period in this country, not 15 miles removed from August 9th, 2014, when the world changed, thus beginning the third civil rights era in the history of this country. I hope that I'm not being too esoteric, and I hope you all remember what happened on August 9th, 2014 without me having to go into detail. But you all find yourselves, St. Charles Community College, studying and pursuing a degree in a country in which only 23% of Americans have a college degree. You find yourselves at the beginning of a journey of pursuing a degree right at the cradle of the start of the third American Reconstruction period. So you find yourselves in a very unique position. Both the time in your lives when you're developing yourselves as intellects and sentient beings and someone who is going to come out and be a contributor to pushing this society forward. At a place geographically where you cannot help but be inundated and reminded that this thing started here. Some people can look to Selma as the start, or Money, Mississippi as the start of the second one. Some people can look to Topeka, Kansas as the start of the second one. Some people can look to any number of different places as the start of the first Reconstruction, Appomattox Courthouse perhaps. But there is no doubt that this third Reconstruction period in this country, which we find ourselves at the precipice of, is based right here in St. Louis, right there in the mighty Mississippi region, where you all happen to find yourselves preparing to deal with the world that is taking place and creating itself while you were studying. So let's get right into it. I've talked a little bit about this being a third Reconstruction period, and I'll explain that. First Reconstruction period, what happens in 1865? And I know we're going to get a little bit more interactive here at the end of it, but 1870, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, effectively freeing the American slave. After about 250 years of bondage, the first slave, Anthony, reaching Richmond, Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia, circa 1619. I hope that you all have read the 1619 Project by now. Wonderful project produced by the New York Times last year. 1865, Lincoln frees the slaves, even though, by the way, some of them didn't come out until Juneteenth. I know that you all know that, perhaps even a year and a half later. 1865 begins the Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction period is codified by 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. Of course, you all know them. 13th Amendment frees the slaves. Of course, there's a part about indentured servitude in prisons, right? We know about that, but we're not going to get into that. 13th Amendment frees the slaves. 14th Amendment guarantees the provisions and protections of equal protection under law to all Americans, regardless of color, race, skin color, or creed. 15th Amendment provides for slavery, equal protection, voting rights. 15th Amendment is voting rights. Doesn't extend to women, but extends to Black freed men. And that's a very important discussion to recognize all along that our freedoms, while gained and while codified in law, didn't always include everyone. You have to have court decision and further evolution of the law for everyone to be included. But our first Reconstruction begins in 1865. 13th Amendment, free the slaves. 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law to everyone, regardless of race or skin color or national origin. 15th Amendment, voting rights to everyone except women. Reconstruction period lasts from 1865 to 1877. Now, a lot of times in my universe in politics, we rejoice and we celebrate when you see an African-American candidate for statewide office, or when you see an African-American running for governor or United States Senate. Reverend Raphael Warnock just won the Georgia Senate seat not too long ago. Good friend of mine. Cory Booker, good friend of mine. But there have only still been 11 Black folks to serve in the United States Senate in the history of our country, and almost 2,000 senators in our history. 11 Black folks. 2 Black women. I hope y'all can name them. But we saw during the Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1877, remarkable gains from the freedmen in this country. It was a shining period where Black people were allowed to participate in the fullness and the bounty and the opportunity of this country, economically, politically, socially, in any number of ways. The South Carolina state legislature became just the second legislative body in the Western Hemisphere to have a majority Black presence, because we were allowed to vote, we were allowed to participate, we were allowed to contribute to candidates. Mississippi became the third. What was the first? What was the first? We often talk about American exceptionalism, but we have to realize that the struggle for liberation, particularly in Black context, is global. The first was 1803. Toussaint Louverture defeats the French and creates the independent nation of Haiti, which I encourage all of you all to go to and witness for yourself. Call me before you go. I got great friends in Haiti. They're wonderful people. 1803 Haiti, 1865 to 1867, the South Carolina legislature is created. You have Black governors, you have Black lieutenant governors, you have Black United States senators, you have Black members of the United States Congress and the House of Representatives, a legitimate Black caucus in Washington, D.C., led by Hiram Revels of Mississippi. You have PBS Pinchback, who serves for 30 days as the governor of Mississippi. You have Black people making economic and social gains. You can trace the oldest Black businesses to this period of 1865 to 1867. What happens in 1876? Much like we just had, there's a presidential election. Samuel Tilden versus Rutherford B. Hayes. I hope you all know who won that, because you know you've never heard of a president, Samuel Tilden, right? So Rutherford B. Hayes became the president because of a compromise called the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, in which the electoral votes from the southern states, the former slave-holding states, agreed to give their votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, thus pushing him over the 270 vote threshold. They agreed to give their votes to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for the United States government pulling out federal troops from their occupation of the United States South. Why were they there? They were there to enforce freedmen's privileges that were given with freeing the slaves in 1865. That's a very important point because it underscores this idea that for Reconstruction to happen, for us to get past the original sins baked into our Constitution and have been there from the existence of this country, for us to get past that, you had to have an active and robust federal enforcement of rights and privileges and safety and existence that was granted to these freedmen. Reconstruction period, a shining period in this country's history, 1865 to 1867, only happens because of actual physical federal enforcement. Why federal? Because the federal government to this day is the only institution in this country who has the resources and the scope, the gravity to actually enforce what we say we want to do. 1876, Hayes-Tilden Compromise, Southern electors, hey, if you get these troops out of here and stop enforcing and making sure we do right by these Black folks, we will give our votes to Rutherford B. Hayes. That deal is struck. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected president by the Electoral College in January of 1877. Immediate withdrawal of federal troops from the former slaveholding states, commonly referred to as the South. Immediate withdrawal. What do we see? What do we see happens immediately? It ends the Reconstruction period. Black people still have the right to vote on paper, but when they show up, they're faced with poll taxes. They're faced with, you got to pay $50 or you can't vote. Well, who had $50? They're faced with grandfather clauses. You can vote if your granddaddy was allowed to vote. Well, what Black person's granddaddy was allowed to vote in 1877 and therefore? You can vote if you tell me how many bubbles are in this bar of soap, or you fill up a jug of pennies. Say how many pennies. You got to tell me precisely how many pennies are in this jar of pennies. And that's when you'll be allowed to vote. It's called the Black Codes, right? Black Codes went into effect immediately following the withdrawal of federal troops in 1877. What else happened? Militias. M-I-L-I-T-I-A-S, not malicious. M-I-L-I-T-I-A. The rise of independent, non-militarized, non-sanctioned militias. Google the Sons of Malta, M-A-L-T-A. Google local paratroop clubs. That's the beginning of policing in this country. There's no record of independent militias and police or law enforcement in this country prior to 1876. There's no record of independent police troops in this country prior to 1876. What do they create themselves to do? To put freed Black people back in their place, to enforce white terrorism, to return the freedmen to their subservient, subjected, subjugated state in the wake of federal troops being withdrawn from the United States South. But that was just public sentiment. Public sentiment after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and after the removal of the federal troops from the South, public sentiment said, okay, let's get back to suppressing these folks and let's get back to white dominance of these folks. Perhaps we can't own them as slaves, but we can enforce a societal order, way of being, way of things that gets Black people back in their rightful place. And they didn't call them Black people, y'all know that. But let's put them back in their rightful place, right? But public sentiment is eventually codified in policy. And in the United States, we make policy through legislatures and through the courts. So what happens in 1896? In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson says that Homer Plessy, a man who is 1/8 Black, perhaps you can call him an octoroon if you want to, but a man who is 1/8, barely perceptible levels of Black blood in his body, is told that he cannot ride on a train in the same accommodations as white folks. Enter the era of Jim Crow and Black codes, codified by Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal doctrines that come into play in 1896 as a reflection of the public sentiment that had been germinating in this country from 1877. So now you have it solidified in law, separate but unequal, separate but equal. Thus officially ends the first Reconstruction period. My point here is that when you have a Reconstruction in this country, When people and institutions and citizens in this country decide to have the courage to act from love and reimagine that we do better with some of the institutions that failed us from the beginning, when we have the audacity to imagine that we can make this world into a better place, there will be a swift and immediate backlash. That is what the history of this country tells us. That's why Reconstruction is met with white suppression and Jim Crow beginning in 1877, codified in 1896. Immediate backlash. Don't forget that it's a recurring theme in the history of this country. 1954, what happens in 1954? So from 1896 to 1954, not only Black people, but this entire country lives in a separate but equal repressive regime. It's important to note that women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. We can't go through this whole half a century without acknowledging that period, right? That right's a great wrong that of course started at the founding of this country, but then was codified again with the 15th Amendment when Black men got the right to vote, but women still did not have the right to vote. 19th Amendment, 1920, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and so many others who we don't recognize by name now fought, and suffragists won their movement, giving women the right to vote. But we're still in a separate but equal system. Until when? Until Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall and his team of lawyers, Thurgood Marshall being the star pupil of Charles Hamilton Houston from Howard University, about 6 blocks down the road from me, until that team of dedicated lawyers decides to attack that system in the only way that we make progress in this country, in the courts. 1954, a whole series of cases consolidated in one, challenging this separate but unequal system, leading up to the culmination, 1954. What happens in 1954? Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, challenging the notion that my Black kids cannot attend the main, the superior, the larger, the more grandiose, the more well-equipped public school in the city of Topeka, Kansas, about 250 miles west of where you all are right now. 1954, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education provides us with the doctrine that separate but equal is inherently unequal. Because this country will never live up to its promise when it comes to Black people if they're not forced to, right? Remember those troops being down there in the South enforcing the freedmen's rights, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, right? So again, 1954, we force integration. We force equality upon states and areas that otherwise would not have integrated peacefully, would not have provided equality and equal opportunity. Separate but unequal is inherently unequal. And pretty much every state in this union can trace back their case. So we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, but that was the culminating case. We talk about Brown and its progeny. That means that there were a whole bunch of cases that built up to Brown that were fought by lawyers, Black and white and brown and yellow, anyone of good conscience who had been admitted to the bars of the various and several states in this country. These people came together and decided that separate but equal was wrong, and they wanted to change it. That culminated in Brown versus Board of Education. But every single state in the union has its case challenging the doctrine of separate but equal. In Missouri, Lloyd Gaines, who knows who Lloyd Gaines was, tried to integrate the University of Missouri in 1938. He was denied, and they created a legal program at Lincoln University to accommodate one man, Lloyd Gaines, right? That law school no longer exists at Lincoln University, but it did exist to accommodate one man, Lloyd Gaines. But Lloyd Gaines had a wonderful career as a lawyer. Oh, wait, no, he didn't, because he disappeared. Some say he went to live in Mexico for the rest of his life, Guadalajara, Tijuana, who knows? But we do know is that Lloyd Gaines was never heard from again because he had the audacity and the courage to challenge the doctrines of separate but unequal in the state of Missouri. But every state, Oklahoma, Sweat versus Painter, Florida, every single state has its own history with the cases that eventually became Brown versus Board of Education. 1954. Separate but equal is inherently unequal. Thus begins the Reconstruction period #2 in this country. It lasts until about 1968. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, and a series of integration and public accommodations cases that come from that. Then you have federal troops forcing integration. Everybody's seen Ruby Bridges, who is 67 years old right now. This is not ancient history. Everybody has seen Ruby Bridges being marched by federal troops into the public school, the elementary school that she was attending in New Orleans, Louisiana. We've seen the tomatoes being thrown at her as memorialized in the wonderful, famous Norman Rockwell painting. It's called The Shame We All Live With. A little girl, 6 years old. Everybody knows the name Vivian Malone. Vivian Malone, who attended the University of Alabama, and Governor George Wallace stood on the steps and blocked her, saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. She had to be walked into the front door of the University of Alabama. Literally the front doorstep of the university is called Chancellor's Hall. She was walked into the front door with federal troops as ordered by John F. Kennedy and his brother, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy. We'll revisit that name later, put a pin in it. It should be noted that when you found Vivian Malone, you had to go to an HBCU, Alabama A&M University, to find a young lady of great reputation and solid demeanor who could have handled the pressure and handled the intense scrutiny of being the first Black student, along with another young man named James, being the first Black student at the University of Alabama. But it should be noted, as you all consider where you're going to transfer to, that when they had to find the talent, they went to a Black school called Alabama A&M University. Vivian Malone attends the University of Alabama as allowed by federal troop enforcement. Charlene Hunter at the time, attends the University of Georgia along with a young brother named Harry Henderson, who they found from Morehouse College. One man, one woman, almost like Noah's Ark, to take this country to a new and free place. So that's Reconstruction number 2, 1954 through Civil Rights legislation, 1964, Equal Housing Act, 1965, Voting Rights Act, through about 1968. Now, what happens in 1968? Wait, before we get to that, let's talk about a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, because this Reconstruction period, 1954, which is the beginning of what we call the modern civil rights movement, I'm referring to as the Second American Reconstruction. 1954 starts with Brown versus Board of Education. 1955, we see this very important communications piece, right? So far the patterns that have existed, I think I skipped over it with the first one, but let's go back and review the patterns. Reconstruction number 1, codified into law by Plessy versus Ferguson, codified into the public mind in 1903 with D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. Imagine being introduced to the magic of moving pictures, movies. Imagine being introduced to the flickering lights of cinema by images showing Blacks as irrepressible sexual animals, and the white man and the Ku Klux Klan being the only redeeming factor that is keeping this nation from plunging into anarchy. Imagine that South Carolina and those Mississippi legislators that we mentioned, who were duly elected, who were intellectual, educated people. Imagine them being depicted as chicken-eating savages on the floor of the Mississippi State Legislature. This is what happened. So you have the law with Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, but it has to be baked into the American psyche by the mass media, the communications tool of the new medium of film. And the first film to be a blockbuster in this country was Birth of a Nation, with the vile images of Black people and white people as the subjugating saviors. Reconstruction number 2, baked into law by Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. But what is the communications piece? The communications piece happened in 1955. What happened in Money, Mississippi in 1955? The lynching of Emmett Till, because he had the audacity to, some say look, some say whistled at a white woman. Bye, baby. Saw her in a convenience store. Imagine walking into a convenience store at age 14, seeing a woman that you thought was attracted to. Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't. It really doesn't matter. But even if he did have the audacity to look at this white woman and say, bye, baby. He was from Chicago. Remember, he didn't know all the rules and elements of the South. He's in Chicago visiting his great uncle Mose Wright. God bless Mose Wright. We'll talk about him later. He looks at this white woman and says, bye, baby. and 5 white men, residents of Money, Mississippi, and Pulaski County, Mississippi, decided that he no longer deserved to live because he did that, and he said that. The communications piece that emanates from that is Jet Magazine, Mamie, M-A-M-I-E, his mama, Mamie Till Mosley, decided that the nascent, meaning brand new, Johnson Publishing Company would display his disfigured and mangled body in an open casket to show the world what they did to my son, to show the world, not this country, because remember, the fight for Black liberation is global, to show the world the horrors of American racism. You will have to look at my Black son, and I hope it haunts you until you decide to get this right. That's the communications piece that solidifies American Reconstruction #2 into the minds and the hearts of the United States. So you have a law with each of these reconstructions. You have a legal piece, but it has to be cemented with a mass communications piece. Ebony Jet Magazine showing the body of Emmett Till. That's the mass communications piece of American Reconstruction Part 2. So each reconstruction comes with 3 elements. What are those? The legal piece, the mass communications piece, and the immediate backlash. The immediate backlash in Reconstruction #1 is the Sons of Malta and the marauding independent militias. The immediate backlash, American Reconstruction #2, war on drugs, welfare reform, housing reform. If you're not married, you cannot live in public accommodations. That's what was told to Black people in Chicago and Dayton and Pittsburgh and New York City and St. Louis, displacing Black families. Now we're talking about folks having the rights to live in thruples and polyamory and same-sex marriage, which we support. I support same-sex marriage. We love everyone having the freedom to love who they love and be who they are and choose to live free and in whatever manner they want, as long as it's consenting adults and it's not hurt anybody. But imagine the United States federal government and state governments and counties and cities still under white supremacist rules saying if you're not married, you can't live together. If you've been caught with marijuana, you cannot benefit from federal housing subsidies. If you have a felony, if you have a misdemeanor for crimes of moral turpitude, loitering, vagrancy, what do we do as Black folk? We hang out on the block. I can't wait to get a shot in my arm so I can go hang out with Professor Tobias on the block. Loitering, he don't do that. Loitering, vagrancy, lose federal housing subsidies, where are you gonna live? Lose the right to take advantage of the GI Bill. Lose the right to go live in certain neighborhoods. This is the systemic stuff that was intentionally put in place as an immediate backlash to the civil rights movement, AKA Reconstruction #2. The patterns never fail. The patterns never fail. So after the war on drugs, as most personified by Richard Nixon and Lee Atwater, and the intentional Southern strategy, Google Southern strategy at the end of this. After all of that, you see a period of Black power and Black consciousness and a movement, intentional movement in the American Black people of Black liberation, Black recognition of Black struggle, the recognition of that Black struggle being global, and Black liberation, independence, and moving forward. So you see a significant period where HBCUs become feeder institutions to the IBMs of the world, to the Anheuser-Busch's of the world, to the Peabody Tire and Peabody Coals and the tire companies and the rubber companies and the plastic companies of the world. And you see 1 or 2 good Black folks who have played by the rules and done the right thing and kept clean shaven faces and don't say curse words and go to church every Sunday. You see 1 or 2 floating into each company, and they hire 1 or 2 behind them. And that opens a period of minor Black progress, and it starts to gain, even despite the enhanced war on drugs from Ronald Reagan in the 80s. But you see some modicum of Black progress even after the Nixonian war on drugs and the immediate backlash to American Reconstruction Part 2. What's the communications piece here? Love him or hate him, I hate him, but the Cosby Show, was a remarkable communications piece in displaying Black excellence. It should be noted that when Marcy Carsey and Tom Werner came to the world's most famous stand-up comedian, William Cosby, in 1981 and say, we want to make a show about you and your life. You will be a limo driver. Your wife will be a school teacher. He was about to make the show, and on the eve of shooting, about a week before shooting, he went to his casting crew and cost them $7 million. He said, we have to rewrite this all because the world needs to see a Black doctor. And the world needs to see a Black lawyer. And we have 5 kids and you're only introduced to 4 at the beginning because the world needs to know that we have an older daughter who's at Princeton because we done made it now. We Ivy League. A lot of folk don't remember Sandra. She had a weird ass husband named Elvin. Sandra and Elvin. I'm a little too old for y'all. Okay, but Professor Tobias remembers. I'm not calling him old. That was a communications piece. Extraordinarily important. And we start to get into the mass media depicted as something other than savages or entertainers and athletes. Important sidebar to the communications piece, 1984. What happens in 1984 happened again in 1988. What happened? 84, 88. Run, Jesse, run. Run, Jesse, run. However you feel about Jesse Jackson and what he became today, I challenge you to go to YouTube when you get a free moment and put in Jesse Jackson in Sesame Street and see how even you feel today in 2021 when a handsome Black man, perhaps 35 years old with a resplendent afro, looks at kids and Big Bird on Sesame Street and says, I am somebody, in the great Negro griot tradition of call and response. I challenge you to not be moved by that. Jesse Jackson running for president in 1984 and 1988, actually winning states, actually winning delegates, giving a remarkable speech on the floor of the Democratic National Convention in the keynote hour. That was a shining moment in Black history. And I will defend Jesse Jackson into the death because he's done more for Black people and Black liberation than so many of his critics have even ever thought to begin to do. And Jesse has his downfalls, and you can criticize Jesse for any number of things, but Jesse has forgotten more about the liberation struggle than so many of his critics ever have. That was a tangent. Please forgive me. But this era of Black progress finds its culmination in 2008. And I know you all are freshmen and sophomores and third years in college, but I also know that you're old enough to know and understand what happened in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. And we can feel how we feel about Barack Obama today. Most people think that he's a centrist. Most people think that he was an accommodationist. Most people don't believe that he did everything he could have done with the power he had at the time that he had it. Most people do, and there's some merit to that. But there is no doubt that for a country that was built on the original sin of slavery, for a country that was built on the idea of human chattel slavery, humans as property and subjugation and white supremacy and sexism and patriarchy, there can be no argument that the election of Barack Obama is a peak and culminating moment in not only American history, but human history. So I'm not saying that that's the start of the second Reconstruction, but I'm saying that it's a moment, third Reconstruction, but I'm saying that it's a moment of incredible progress, and his administration for 8 years was the face of not only Black, but human excellence on the highest global stage. You saw the possibilities of an America that's inclusive. You saw the possibilities of an America that intentionally rejects inequality. We saw the possibilities of an America in which everyone has a fair and equitable stake. But what happened afterward? Remember the patterns. Immediate backlash. Immediate backlash in the election of objectively a horrendous human being. Feel how you feel about the politics of the modern day Republican Party. Feel however you feel about the politics and the qualifications of Donald Trump. Feel however you feel about whatever he had to say or do for the business community in terms of tax cuts, in terms of deregulation of various industries, and we can debate all of that. But the reality of the matter is, that we elected a human being who is objectively unqualified for the job and morally unfit to assume the mantle of leadership for the nation's most inspiring country. Because to be clear, when humanity moves forward, it's because America, the shining city on the hill, decides to get our act together and lead the way. Through policy, through public sentiment, through the law, through mass communications, human rights are preserved. The world moves forward in terms of voiding inequality, ridding human rights abuses, defeating dictatorship, supporting the spread of democracy. The world moves at America's example, and we cannot deny that. So what example are we setting to the world by electing as our commander-in-chief, electing as our chief communications officer, electing as the face and the leader of our country a person who was objectively not qualified in terms of actual meritorious communications, but was actually morally unqualified at the core of his being? All of the stuff that happened over these last 4 dismal years, all of the stuff that happened was fundamentally predictable. All of the stuff that happened was laid bare before us throughout the course of the campaign, from the moment in 2015 when he came down an escalator and said that Mexicans are not sending their best people. They're sending rapists. They're sending murderers. All of that was on the table. And we decided to do what we did because this is what we do in America. We chase progress. We chase human rights progress with an immediate backlash. But it didn't start with the election of Donald Trump. Immediately in 2008, after the election of Barack Obama, January 2009, I was a 29-year-old member of the Missouri House of Representatives in January of 2009, and I saw a gathering of people on the front lawn about 110 miles west from you all in Jefferson City. I saw a gathering of folks, some of my colleagues, including the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the House. I saw them gathered up with some folks dressed in costume on the front lawn of the People's Building, the Capitol. And they were dressed up like George Washington, and they had these flags. Some were American flags, but some were American flags that looked like Betsy Ross had sewn them with the original colonies, and some said 1776, and some had these strange yellow and green flags with a coiled up snake around them, but they had these hats on that looked like they were George Washington crossing the Delaware River, and they had these flutes. I said, what is this? This looks like a pretty cool gathering. I like costume parties. I would love to hang out with these guys, perhaps in the spirit of bipartisanship. I don't like to pay taxes. I make a little bit of money now. I don't like to pay taxes. I don't like for government to tell me what to do. Let me go hang out with these guys. You've never heard of the Tea Party prior to the election of a black man to be the chief executive of the United States of America. I defy you to go and find on record a mention of the Tea Party Express, the Freedom Caucus. It doesn't exist before January 20th of 2009. The Tea Party was an immediate, visceral, and violent and knee-jerk backlash to the election of the first black man to head the United States government and all that represented. I'm winding down here, Professor. I know we're probably playing with our time here. But that's what the Tea Party was, and it's important that we acknowledge that because it didn't start in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. It started as an immediate backlash to the election of our first black president. So where are we now? In a universe in which that immediate backlash, that post-Barack Obama immediate backlash, results in not only Tea Parties, but people who fundamentally do not believe in a participatory democracy, when we have seen them take over state legislatures and city councils and county councils and even the federal government. When we have seen an insurrection causing the death of 5 folks, including police officers, because a majority of white people did not decide the winner of the most recent presidential election. And let's be clear, that's what it was about. An insurrection happened because white folks as a majority, did not determine the winner. Okay? Therefore, they have to have cheated, because the majority of white folks, this ain't the outcome we want. They have to have cheated. Well, there's nothing exactly new because Democrats have not won the majority of the white vote in the presidential election since 1960, right? But what is new is we as Americans have intentionally created, fostered, and fomented an environment where since 2009, 2010, it's okay to say these outrageous things out loud. It's okay to actively suppress the vote of minority communities. It's okay to grab them by the you-know-what. It's okay. We'll still elect you. Boss says it's okay, as Dave Chappelle says. Right? It's okay to do these objectively abhorrent things out in the public. And not only will there be no backlash, but you might get rewarded for that type of behavior. That's the difference. And so we find ourselves at the precipice of Reconstruction number 3. And that's where you all come in, St. Charles Community College. What is your role as you sit and try to get a little piece of paper that only 23% of your countrymen have, a college degree, in pursuit of higher education? What is your role? Not only in the name of Black excellence and Black legacy, because I know that there's some non-Black folks watching and with us here today who want to stand in solidarity and want to push this country forward, or maybe even pull it forward, kicking and screaming. What is your role? What is your obligation? What do people of good faith and good conscience expect? And I do say expect very intentionally. Not what do we want of you, not what do we believe you'll do. What is the expectation? What is your obligation as we are on the precipice of Reconstruction number 3? If you want to see this country move forward, if you want to see democracy preserved, if you want to see us commit to our founding principles, if you want to see us get to a place where we do not demonize Republicans or demonize Trump supporters, but we push ourselves to a place where hate and bigotry and inequality have no quarter to breathe. What do we expect of you? We being what Dr. King called the beloved community, people who believe that we can push the world forward, pull it forward, kicking and screaming. What do we expect of you? I submit that there are 3 things. Number 1, read. Read. We went through a history lesson because history is instructive. Reading is instructive. And when I was growing up, there was a huge ad campaign that said reading is fundamental. And I thought that was kind of self-explanatory, but sometimes you got to say the self-explanatory stuff out loud. Put down them phones. There is stuff that's not on your Instagram feed. There's stuff that you need to know about that's not on TikTok or Facebook. Get into the basics. Who has read Franz Fanon, Savage Inequalities? Who has read Dr. Ibram Kendi, How to Be Anti-Racist, Stamped from the Beginning? Who has read Professor Derek Bell, Faces at the Bottom of the Well? Who has read the collective essays and works of Dr. Cornel West? Who has read the autobiography of Martin Luther King? Who has read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me? You have to read. There's no possibility, but there's no need of reinventing intellectual wheels. All of the great issues and problems and dilemmas of the day have been wrestled with before. You have to commit yourself to finding what's out there, finding these knowledge, deciding that you will commit to understanding why you believe what you believe and being willing to change what you believe. You got to read. Number 2, become a SME, SME, subject matter expert. You have got to develop subject matter expertise in every field of human endeavor. I don't care if you commit to being an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer, a janitor, a custodian, a school teacher, in every field of human endeavor. Against the backdrop of a country that was built exclusively for the benefit by, for, and of wealthy white men. In a country in which that is our foundation, and let's be clear, it's beyond debate that that is the foundation of this country. In a country like that, Every field of human endeavor in this country is wrought with inequality and therefore has a substantial amount of improvement to be made. Therefore, whatever your universe of expertise is, there is significant space in that world, in that niche base of expertise for you to do something to make the world a better place. The doctor has a role in the face of dramatic healthcare inequalities, with not only the COVID-19 crisis, but all of the pre-existing comorbidities which made it so much worse in certain communities. The architect has a role in building safe and effective and affordable housing for everybody. The banker has a role in ensuring access to capital and opportunity. The teacher has a role to mold the minds. Of course, the lawyer has a role. How do we think Plessy versus Ferguson happened? How do we think Brown versus Board of Education happened? How do we think marriage and inequality cases happen? The artist has a role. Oh my goodness, the artist has a role. Artists are the documenters of the time we live in. In any period in human history, artists are the ones who are right next to the historians in preserving the legacy of that time so future generations understood an accurate picture of what it was like. My goodness, the artist has a role. All art is political. Art without politics is simply propaganda, and that's not art at all. The artist has a role, the poet has a role, the singer has a role, the songwriter has a role, the painter has a role. Of course, art has a role in the struggle. Commit yourself to developing a subject matter expertise, because within your realm of expertise, there's an opportunity to make the world a better place. Number 3, read. Number 1, read. Number 2, become a subject matter expert and commit yourself to excellence in that universe of expertise. Number 3, commit yourself to something larger than yourself. There's no room for selfishness in a beloved community, in a universe of people who are trying to push or pull the world to a better place. You have to commit to something, a cause, an institution, a universe, a community that is bigger than yourself. Some call it public service. Commit to service of the public. And that doesn't mean running for office. There are many ways to lead. There are many ways to serve. Almost none of them have to do with putting one's name on a ballot. Commit yourself to being a tutor at the local school. Commit yourself to going and volunteering at a church. You don't have to create a foundation. There are so many institutions out there. Commit yourself to doing something other than generating wealth and capital for yourself and your immediate family. Commit yourself to public service. Commit yourself to a cause, to a community, to a group of people larger than yourself. That is where humanity finds its best and highest calling. When expertise, and so much of expertise is gotten by reading, when expertise is used in the service of a calling larger than yourself. Yes, the tattoo artist has a role. I know you're saying we can go through that later. Commit yourself to becoming a subject matter expert and using that expertise in service of something larger than yourself. And the last thing I would suggest, just a bonus, because Professor Tobias was expecting my 3 points. He's heard them before. The last thing I would suggest is a commitment to critical thinking. And I don't say thinking for yourself. Everybody thinks for themselves. A lot of people think dumb stuff that they created and concocted themselves, but commit yourself to critically thinking. Being able to look at a situation, a set of circumstances, and breaking down elements. What is the history behind this? What is the current status of this? What is the future of this? How do different people across the world approach this problem? Because for the third time, the struggle for liberation is global. The struggle for equality and eradicating inequality is global. It's a shared human experience, much like this pandemic. The powerful element of this pandemic, I think I'll look back and say 50 years from now, is that it was the first truly shared global experience of our lifetime. But I believe that the struggle for human equality is a shared global experience. And there's things you can learn from the farmers right now in India. There's things you can learn from the human rights struggle in Myanmar, Myanmar. You should Google that and see what's going on over there. There's things that you can learn from the Mau Mau and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. There's things that you can learn from the Inuit people and their struggle for independence in foreign hinterlands that are often considered tundras. Commit yourself to something larger than yourself and commit to approaching these ideas from the lens of thinking critically. And finally, commit yourself to approaching these ideas from a space of love. None of the world's great dilemmas, no issue in human history has ever been solved by hate. But hate is easy. It's easy to identify a hateful block of people and eliminate them from a universe of polite public discourse. It's easy to identify and get rid of people who are operating from a base of hate. But just because you're not based in hate does not mean you have made a commitment to operating and dealing with fellow human beings in a space of love. Most people deal from a space of indifference, and that's every bit as dangerous, far more dangerous, I would submit, than dealing from a space of hate. We can get rid of them. Most people are motivated by nothing, and we live our lives in a fog. That's far more dangerous. How much talent has been wasted? How much human capital has gone down the drain because people have not found a cause greater than themselves to attach themselves to and live the average American life of 76 years in a space of dramatic and crippling indifference. In a universe in which only 23% of the population of the greatest country in the history of the world have a college degree. You are the best we got, and you cannot operate from a space of indifference. That, my friends, that, St. Charles, would be tragic for the people who are blessed with a higher education to operate from a space of indifference. You have to commit, even in the face of people who hate you, even in the face of people who don't agree with you, even in the face of people who don't believe that you have a right to exist, you have to commit to critically thinking from a space of love. I love you, St. Charles Community College. That's all I got. Hopefully we can chat and talk some questions. Like I said, I'm gonna get this shot in my arm and we can hopefully do this in person in the fall. But
I hope that we can
stay in the fight, and hopefully we can chat a little bit.
No, I hope that we do able to do this in the fall. You give a lot of passionate information, which is going to be good. And obviously, because it's on YouTube, they can go back and watch it. There were 2 quick questions that people ask, which are going to tap more into your experience relating to voting. So the first question is actually focused on voter turnout. And so the idea is like, what changes would you make what specific changes would you make to promote voter turnout? Because the suggestion online was maybe reimbursing voters for their time if they have to wait more than an hour.
It's a great question. That's a great question. So there are, just as there is a voter suppression agenda, we have to, people of good faith, and I say we, not meaning Democrats. Obviously, I am a rabidly partisan Democrat, but we as in people of good faith have to commit ourselves to promoting a voter protection agenda. And beyond that, a ballot box expansion agenda, right? So what are the elements of a ballot box expansion agenda? First of all, I believe Election Day should be a holiday. I believe that Election Day should be off. In some other highly developed countries, Election Day is not only a holiday, but Election Week is a holiday. And that doesn't mean you don't have to go to work, but that means that your absence is excused because you're going out to vote. A lot of people, particularly people who still work hourly wage jobs, cannot afford to take the time off to stand in line to vote. They cannot afford to miss that work. They cannot afford to put their kids in childcare because they have to go vote. That, my friends, is tantamount to a poll tax. Remember we talked about earlier, pennies in a jar, or having to pay $50? If you cannot vote because you cannot miss the time away from your hourly wage job, that is tantamount to a poll tax. If you cannot vote because it takes 3 hours of you standing in a line and you cannot miss that income from a day, that is tantamount to a poll tax. So Election Day should be a day off. Secondly, we have to get rid of these extraordinarily narrow and restricting voter ID requirements. Every time I go to a polling place, the person who works there knows who I am. She knows who my family is. And if you want to have a voter ID, then accept all forms of ID. You would be surprised. It sounds easy to say, well, everybody has a driver's license. No, they don't. It sounds easy to say, well, everybody has an ID card. No, they don't. There are populations in this country, United States citizens, people who live and breathe here just like you and I, who are sufficiently detached from the everyday flow of commerce and the everyday flow of the normal institutions, the malls, the sporting events that all of us participate in. There's a whole lot of people out there who don't participate in these things, and they're very unlikely to have an official state issued ID. And here's how you get around the idea, the falsity of voter fraud. When you vote here, you sign an affidavit saying I am who I say I am under pains and penalties of perjury, and I'm willing to go to jail if I'm lying, right? That's how you get past that. Because the reality is nobody is going into a polling place voting under the name of somebody who they claim to be if that's not them. That's not happening. That's not happening. So voter ID and so many of the other voter suppression techniques are fundamentally a solution in search of a problem. The problem does not exist. And statistically, over the history of this country, we know that voter fraud is not a thing. However, when we have uncovered it, North Carolina, 8th Congressional District, 2018, is Republicans, right? Cheating, stuffing ballot boxes, so on and so forth. So voter fraud is not a thing from the Democratic perspective. I would say, lastly, expand early voting. Voting, we should not be talking about election day. That should be a thing of the past. We should be talking about an election season. And during these 30 days is when an election takes place. During these 3 weeks is when an election takes place. And you need to find time, like you see the commercials these days saying, plan your vaccine, plan your vote. During these 3 weeks, find time to get to a polling place, be it by mail, be it by absentee balloting, be it by voting in person at the polling places during these 3 weeks, right? Find your way to vote. If you need to get a ride, that's enough time to plan your vote. We should be talking about an election season and an election period as opposed to restricting voting to an election day. But there's so many more elements. There's so many different levers and nuances that we could that could be adjusted and done so fairly and done so while not promoting fraud, by the way, which still doesn't exist. There are so many different levers that we can adjust, and we should be thinking about mail-in voting, internet voting. We have tremendous amounts of internet security. Why can't we do that, over the internet? So there's a whole bunch of ways that really smart people in the voter rights community are thinking about. But that's a great question, and I think we just have to have the courage to dive into them.
I hear you. Okay, so I'm going a little bit long, and there are a couple other questions, but there is one question.
I'm good. We can keep going.
No, for the faculty and staff here, and I know Nick has other things, but there are 2 other questions. I think I can answer one of them quickly because one of them is asking, is Missouri considered a voter suppressed state? And I would suggest that typically if anybody's putting anything in place to restrict voting, then by definition.
By definition it is. I mean, we see historically in well, first of all, Missouri has no early voting, right? We had it this year because of COVID, but there is no early voting in Missouri. There is absentee voting for a certain period if you have an excuse. And if you have excuse-based absentee voting, that means that somebody who wants to challenge your vote can say, prove to me that you were in Chicago on this day during this time, thus justifying you've proved to me that you were sick or you had to work. And if you can't come up with book, chapter, and verse showing that you needed to vote absentee, guess what? You're potentially guilty of a felony. That's voter suppression. So with having excuse-based absentee voting, that should move to no excuse absentee. By having no early voting period, by having these extraordinarily stringent voter ID requirements that we have to challenge in court cycle after cycle after cycle, and people are doing great work to do that, but it shouldn't have to come to that. absolutely Missouri is a voter suppressed state. And the next time a Democrat asks you for your vote or for your support or for a contribution or your endorsement, you need to ask them, what pro-voter bills have you filed? I'm looking at you, Missouri Democratic Party, because I know the answer is 0.
There's a shot fired. Okay. So the last question we got, then I'm gonna thank you and appreciate. The last question is, how do we get involved in changing voting reform here in Missouri?
I think that we need to, first of all, a couple things. That is a great question. And there are multiple ways to skin a cat. So we see in Missouri, in Jeff City, that there is an active voter suppression agenda. But as I said at the end of the last answer, where's the voter protection agenda? Who has filed that? Crystal Quaid is your your House Minority Leader. I believe that Brian Williams or one of his, Rizzo out of Kansas City is your Senate Minority Leader. Where is their unified voter protection, ballot box expansion agenda? So we as voters who are inclined to vote Democratic have to demand a counter agenda, right? And those bills should be being filed, and we should be tweeting about them and promoting them on social media and putting out mailers about them and trying to build public sentiment behind an affirmative agenda as opposed to just voting no, right? The way to push policy is creating an affirmative agenda rather than just playing defense all the time. Because if you're playing, I'm a big boxing guy. As you can see, I have a portrait of Muhammad Ali tattooed on my forearm. But if you're playing defense at all times, you're on the ropes, getting hit. When do you have time to throw punches? You can't win a fight without going on offense. You can't win a fight without throwing punches. So where's the voter protection ballot box expansion agenda? That's number one. Number two, I think that we have to support the people who are already doing the work. Laura Granich runs a wonderful organization you all should Google called Shared Roots. Shared Roots promotes voter turnout, promotes ballot box expansion, funds the lawyers who are doing this work, gets Missourian expats like myself from all over the country to participate in the work of fighting against gerrymandering and really just the holistic business of democracy. So we need to know who these people are and support their work. Everybody's like, where's our Stacey Abrams? There is a woman in North St. Louis who runs an organization called Action St. Louis. Her name is Kayla Reed, Kaylareed. I am under the opinion that if Missouri is ever to be saved, Kayla Reed will be the Messiah. Kayla Reed is a remarkable leader who has built an amazing institution and is getting incredible amounts of diverse people engaged. I watched Judas and the Black Messiah a couple weeks ago on HBO Max. Wonderful movie. I highly recommend it. And when I saw Chairman Fred Hampton preaching and working and dedicating his life to the struggle, I said, that's Kayla Reed. We have that today. But the reason Kayla Reed does not get the love and doesn't get the respect and has not made the headlines, first of all, is because she's dedicated herself to doing the work and not being all in the videos, all in the songs, dancing. Welcome to Death Row. That's a Suge Knight reference. But the reason she doesn't get the love is because she's a queer young Black woman in a universe where even liberals, even progressives are looking for the next Barack Obama, whether wins or not. We're looking for the next King's English speaking Morehouse graduate who's going to come in and save the day. That's not where it is. Leadership today and for sure into the future is going to come from communities who have been marginalized, who have been set aside, who have been pushed aside, because while all of us were at the parties, they was learning and they was building and they was developing an agenda and they were organizing. And guess what? I don't want to spend my time fighting with someone who doesn't believe I have the right to exist about how to get them onto my side. No. I want to expand the pie. And if the pie is to be expanded, we're going to have to look to an unconventional base of leadership, people who have been marginalized and excluded from leadership processes in the past. Why? Because they know people like them and they can bring them on board. We have to increase numbers. It's simple math. Elections in democracy and freedom and liberation in a democratic universe is simple math. We need more of them than we do people who want to keep us held back. So where is that more going to come from? And we have to have the courage to look beyond the pulpits and the official original institutions where Black leadership has derived itself from. And we have to include everybody, and in everybody under the scope of this big tent, if we're going to have the math, the numbers to move the cause of liberation forward.
I appreciate that. That was the last question, and I want, we're gonna have to get together face to face and bring this. There's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to unpack. But I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank the college for allowing us this particular platform. There's obviously much more to talk about, much more that we can share. I got support from my deans, Dean Mara, Dean Herbal. They were like, just go ahead and do it. And that's always good to hear when you want to try and bring people, trying to get people to listen, people to communicate. So that was there. I want to stress to everybody in St. Charles who's watching this is, of course, streaming on YouTube. So go back, get those resources, get those books. Point one, read. You gotta. My man gave you a list of reading material. Get that book club together and start dipping into it. But I also want to express my gratitude to you, sir, because when I reached out to you, there was no hesitation. It was pretty much just like, just tell me when and we ready. And I always appreciate that.
Anytime, man. Well, I like to talk and I like you too. So you're good.
No, you're good. And I won't have to do any of the backstories or anything like that. So you're good there. And anyone who's listening, I'm not going to get into the politics of that. So I just want to say I appreciate you and I thank you. And we definitely got to make sure we set this up again. And I appreciate everyone who listened and streamed. Thank Nick Wallace for allowing us to stream this on live. I appreciate it. And I thank you, sir. Any last words you want to say?
Hey, I appreciate y'all for having me. Thank you so much, Professor Tobias, everybody, university community. It takes a community to pull these things off. Brother Nick, who I've been seeing down here this whole time. But everybody who joined us, God bless. Thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you, sir.
You got it.